Ethan's chest heaved as he faced the crowd at the firm's gala, his voice shaking but firm. "You think you can humiliate me, destroy my life, and walk away untouched?" His voice boomed, silencing the laughter and clinking glasses. "Well, I've got news for all of you. Every lie, every crime, every betrayal is coming to light tonight." All eyes turned to Leia and her colleagues, their smug grins fading into panic as Ethan pulled out a USB drive. "This drive contains everything: financial records, emails, and proof of your schemes. And trust me, justice is already in motion." The room erupted in murmurs, while Leah's face drained of color. Mark, her smug alpha coworker, stepped forward, his confident facade crumbling as Ethan continued, "Everyone here will know who you truly are." The weight of his words hung heavy, a storm brewing that would bring their empire crashing down. But before we dive deeper into this story, let me know in the comments below where you're watching from. And if you're loving this tale of betrayal and justice, don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another story like this. Stay tuned. Ethan sat alone in his dimly lit apartment, the only sound the rhythmic ticking of a clock on the wall. In his hand, he clutched a cracked wedding photo, its gilded frame now bent and jagged. He traced Leah's face in the image with his finger, lingering on her radiant smile. The picture captured their wedding day. Ethan in a sharp gray suit, Leah in a simple, elegant gown, her eyes sparkling with joy. The photo slipped from his trembling hand and shattered as it hit the hardwood floor, glass scattering in all directions. Ethan stared at the mess, his breath uneven. "This was supposed to be forever?" he whispered, his voice raw with disbelief. "How did it all fall apart?" He rose to his feet, pacing the room. Memories flooded his mind. Bittersweet flashes of laughter, shared secrets, and a bond he once believed unbreakable. But there were shadows in those memories now, small cracks in the perfection he had once cherished. Leah had swept into his life like a summer storm, unexpected, exhilarating, and impossible to ignore. Ethan met her at a small bookstore downtown, where she was thumbing through a copy of The Great Gatsby. Her laughter, light and melodic, drew his attention from across the room. "That's a classic," he said, summoning the courage to approach her. She looked up, her hazel eyes sparkling. "You think so? It's my fourth time reading it. Gatsby's obsession with the green light gets me every time." Ethan grinned. "Fourth time? Sounds like true love. Or maybe masochism." Leah laughed, a sound that felt like sunshine breaking through clouds. "Maybe a bit of both." That was the beginning. They fell into each other's lives with an ease that felt fated. Ethan's steadiness complemented Leah's vibrant energy. He was the planner, the one who kept things grounded, while she was the dreamer, always chasing the next adventure. They spent hours talking about everything and nothing. Leah shared her love for Paris, the city she had always dreamed of visiting, while Ethan confessed his secret passion for cooking. Together, they created an adventure fund, a small mason jar where they'd drop loose change and dollar bills for future travels. "Someday," Leah said, holding the jar up to the light, watching the coins glint, "this will take us somewhere magical." Ethan believed her. In those early years, life felt effortless. They moved into a cozy apartment filled with mismatched furniture and their shared laughter. Evenings were spent cuddling on the couch, Ethan's arm draped over Leah as they watched old movies. But life had a way of dulling the shine. Leah started working long hours at a prestigious law firm, and Ethan's job as a CPA became increasingly demanding. The adventure fund jar, once a symbol of shared dreams, sat forgotten on the kitchen counter, its contents untouched for months. At first, Ethan brushed off the changes. Relationships evolved, didn't they? But small things began to gnaw at him. Leah started staying late at work more often than not, coming home exhausted and distracted. Her once bubbly energy seemed muted, her laughter less frequent. Then there was the phone, always within her grasp, tilted away from his view. She'd smile faintly at messages, offering vague explanations when he asked. "It's just work stuff," she said one night, her tone breezy but distant. Ethan nodded, trying to ignore the unease blooming in his chest. It was during one of their rare dinners together that Ethan caught a glimpse of something that didn't sit right. Leah's phone buzzed, lighting up briefly on the table. She reached for it quickly, but not before Ethan saw the name on the screen. R? He frowned. Who's R? Leah's hand froze for a fraction of a second before she smiled. Just a colleague. We're working on a big case and he's been messaging me nonstop. Ethan wanted to believe her, but the doubt was there now, a faint but insistent whisper. As the evening wore on, Leah seemed restless, checking her phone more than usual. She excused herself early, claiming exhaustion, leaving Ethan alone at the table. He stared at the untouched wine in his glass, a cold knot forming in his stomach. Leah's laughter once felt like sunlight, warm and unwavering. Now it carried an edge, a shadow he couldn't ignore. Little did he know, the cracks in their perfect life were only the beginning. The first time Leah mentioned staying late at work, Ethan barely noticed. Deadlines and long hours were nothing new in her demanding job at the firm. She'd often joked about living in the office, fueled by coffee and ambition. At first, it was easy to brush off, but then it became routine. Leah's once predictable schedule turned erratic, with late nights stretching into weekends. Dinner plans were canceled at the last minute, and quiet evenings together became increasingly rare. When Ethan voiced his concern, Leah's responses were always smooth and practiced. "It's just a big case," she said, leaning over to kiss his forehead. "I promise, things will slow down soon." Her words were soothing, but something felt off. Ethan couldn't place it, so he told himself to trust her. After all, wasn't that what marriage was built on? Ethan noticed other changes too, subtle at first, like shadows lengthening with the setting sun. Leah's laughter, once rich and full, seemed thinner now, like it was holding a secret she didn't want to share. Her phone, previously left casually on counters and tables, was always within reach, its screen turned just out of view. "Work emails," she'd explain if he glanced at it too long. Ethan tried to ignore the pang of doubt that came with every buzz and chime. He knew Leah was driven and dedicated to her career, but this new guardedness was unfamiliar. One evening, as they sat on the couch, Ethan made an attempt to reconnect. "You've been so busy lately," he said, his tone light but hopeful. "Maybe we should take a weekend trip, just the two of us. Get away from all the stress." Leah smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "That sounds nice," she said absently, scrolling through her phone. Her disinterest stung more than Ethan cared to admit. Still, he reasoned with himself, convincing his heart what his mind refused to entertain. "She's just tired," he thought. "It's all the pressure at work. Once this case is over, everything will go back to normal." A few weeks later, they sat across from each other at their favorite Italian restaurant, a rare night out together. Leah looked stunning, her hair swept into an elegant bun, the emerald necklace he had given her glinting in the soft light. For a moment, Ethan allowed himself to believe that everything was fine. They laughed about old memories, shared plates of pasta, and clinked glasses of wine. It felt like a glimpse of the life they used to have before the late nights and strained silences. Then Leah's phone buzzed on the table, shattering the moment. She reached for it quickly, her fingers wrapping around the device before Ethan could see the screen. But he caught a glimpse, just enough to read the words, "See you soon." Yes. The tension in the air was palpable. Ethan cleared his throat, trying to keep his voice steady. "Who's R?" Leah froze for the briefest of moments, her thumb hovering over the screen. Then she smiled faintly, a practiced ease that only deepened Ethan's unease. "Just a work thing," she said, slipping her phone into her purse. "Don't overthink it, Ethan." Her response hung in the air, light and dismissive, but it did little to ease his growing doubts. As they finished their meal, Leah's laughter rang out again, but this time it felt hollow, an echo of something that used to be real. Ethan couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the shadows in their life were growing darker, and for the first time, he wondered if they would ever truly fade. Leah's late nights became more frequent, and her presence at home felt more like an obligation than a comfort. Plans Ethan had once looked forward to, date nights, lazy Sundays, even their tradition of watching old black and white films, were canceled with increasing regularity. "I can't tonight," Leah said one Friday, not looking up from her phone. "There's a last-minute meeting I can't get out of." Ethan sighed, trying to hide his disappointment. "We've had this dinner planned for weeks, Leah." Her response was quick, almost rehearsed. "I know, and I'm sorry, but this case is important. You understand, don't you?" He wanted to. He really did. But the words tasted hollow now, repeated so often that their sincerity felt worn thin. It wasn't just the cancellations. Leah's phone, once a shared part of their lives, had become a fortress. She carried it with her everywhere, even to the bathroom, and tilted the screen away whenever it lit up. Ethan couldn't help but notice the subtle changes. Her tone, once casual when discussing work, had grown overly formal, as though she were sticking to a carefully constructed script. "It's just the usual stuff," she'd say with a breezy smile when he asked about her day. "You know how it is. Deadlines, office drama, nothing interesting." But the way her eyes flicked away, the slight tension in her voice, it was enough to make him wonder. Her phone buzzed constantly now, and she'd glance at it like it carried secrets she couldn't let slip. When Ethan asked, she'd laugh, brushing it off. "It's nothing," she said one evening, her voice light but distant. "You worry too much." But it didn't feel like nothing. It felt like everything. One night, Ethan decided to test the waters. As they sat in the living room, Leah scrolling through her phone, he leaned over, feigning curiosity. "Who are you texting so much these days?" he asked, keeping his tone casual. Leah's fingers stilled for a fraction of a second before she turned to him, her expression unreadable. "Just work stuff. Why?" Ethan shrugged, forcing a smile. "No reason. Just seems like you're glued to that thing lately." Leah laughed, but it sounded forced. "You're imagining things. Besides, it's just boring work emails. Trust me, you're not missing anything." The conversation ended there, but the unease lingered. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that Leah was slipping away, one guarded glance and evasive answer at a time. As the weeks passed, Ethan started noticing other inconsistencies. Leah would mention a work event, but her details were vague. And when he pressed for more, her answers often contradicted earlier statements. "Didn't you say the meeting was with clients?" Ethan asked one evening. Leah paused, her fork halfway to her mouth. "Oh, right, it was, but Mark decided to join us last minute. You know how he is, always micromanaging." Ethan nodded, but his mind raced. She hadn't mentioned Mark before, and the way she stumbled over her words felt uncharacteristic. Leah was usually sharp and composed, especially when it came to work. It was as if she was trying too hard to keep the story straight. Late one night, Ethan lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Beside him, Leah's breathing was steady and even, but her phone rested on the nightstand, its screen dark and silent. A part of him wanted to reach for it, to find answers to the questions that had been gnawing at him. But another part, the part that still clung to trust, held him back. Instead, he closed his eyes, hoping for sleep to quiet the storm inside him. But even in the silence, doubt had already taken root, and it was growing. Would you like to continue with the next segment or refine this section? Ethan waited until the following evening to bring it up. Leah had come home later than usual, her expression tight and guarded. She barely said hello before retreating to the kitchen, rummaging through the fridge for leftovers. The tension was thick, but Ethan knew he couldn't let it go this time. "Leah," he began cautiously, leaning against the counter, "we need to talk." She didn't look up, her focus on peeling the lid off a container. "About what?" "You've been different lately," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. "You're distant. It feels like you're not really here anymore." Leah froze for a moment, then turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "I'm working a lot, Ethan. You know that. It's not like I'm doing it for fun." "I get that," he replied, his voice steady but firm. "But it's not just work. You've been avoiding me. You barely talk to me anymore. And your phone—" "What about my phone?" Leah snapped, her tone suddenly sharp. Ethan hesitated. "You're always on it. You tilt the screen away like you don't want me to see. It feels like you're hiding something. Leah laughed, but there was no humor in it. Hiding something? Really? God, Ethan, maybe I'm just tired of you questioning me all the time. Her words hit like a slap. Ethan took a step back, his frustration bubbling to the surface. I wouldn't have to question you if you didn't act so secretive. Do you even hear yourself? Every time I try to ask, you shut me out. Leah's eyes narrowed, her jaw tightening. Do you know how exhausting it is to come home and deal with this? I'm working my ass off to keep up at the firm, and instead of supporting me, you're accusing me of, what, cheating? Lying? I never said that, Ethan shot back, though the words felt dangerously close to the truth. But something's going on, Leah. You're not the same. We're not the same. But Leah shook her head, her voice dropping to a cold, measured tone. Maybe you're just imagining things. Or maybe you're the one who's changed, Ethan. You've been so fixated on this idea that something's wrong, you're making it a self-fulfilling prophecy. Ethan stared at her, disbelief etched on his face. This isn't about me, it's about us, about how you're pulling away. I'm not pulling away, she said, her voice rising slightly. I'm trying to keep up with my career, Ethan, something you should understand considering how much you bury yourself in work, too. That's different. And you know it, he said, his voice shaking now. When have I ever made you feel like you didn't matter, like I wasn't here for you? Leah didn't respond right away. She crossed her arms, leaning against the counter. I don't know what you want me to say. I'm doing my best, Ethan. If that's not enough for you, then maybe you need to take a look at your expectations. The conversation spiraled further, their words sharper and more defensive with each exchange. Ethan tried to reel it back, desperate to salvage some understanding. I'm not asking for perfection, he said, his voice softer now, almost pleading. I'm just asking for honesty, for you to tell me what's really going on. Leah sighed, running a hand through her hair. What's going on is that I'm stretched too thin, and instead of helping, you're piling more pressure on me. Ethan felt his frustration reach a boiling point. This isn't pressure, Leah. It's about trust. Do you even realize how hard it is to feel like I'm losing you? Her expression flickered. Was that guilt? Or just annoyance? Ethan couldn't tell. You're not losing me, she said finally, her voice flat. You're just overthinking everything, like you always do. Why? Ethan looked at her, his chest tight with a mixture of anger and hurt. You really think this is all in my head? Leah turned away, grabbing her phone from the counter. I don't know what else to tell you. I'm tired, Ethan. I need some space. Can we not do this tonight? The words felt final, a wall between them that Ethan didn't know how to break through. He watched as Leah disappeared down the hallway, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. For a moment he stood frozen, replaying the argument in his head. Every word, every defensive glance, every evasion. It all felt like confirmation of the one thing he didn't want to believe. Ethan sank into a chair, his hands trembling as he stared at the empty room. The gap between them had never felt so wide. And for the first time, he wasn't sure if they could ever bridge it again. The holiday party was held at an upscale downtown hotel, its grand ballroom glittering with chandeliers and garlands of twinkling lights. Ethan adjusted his tie as he stepped inside, scanning the crowd for Leah. She had left early to help set up, and he felt a mix of nervous anticipation and unease as he navigated the sea of finely dressed colleagues and their plus ones. Spotting her near the bar, Ethan smiled and raised a hand in greeting, but Leah didn't notice. She was standing close to Mark, a tall man with sharp features and a commanding presence. They were deep in conversation, her posture relaxed and animated in a way Ethan hadn't seen in months. He made his way over, weaving through clusters of laughing coworkers. Hey, Ethan said, placing a hand lightly on Leah's arm. She turned, her smile faltering for a split second before she recovered. Ethan, you made it. Mark nodded politely, extending a hand. You must be Leah's husband. I've heard a lot about you. Nice to meet you, Ethan replied, gripping Mark's hand firmly. His tone was friendly, but there was an underlying tension in the way Mark's gaze lingered on Leah, as if there was an unspoken understanding between them. 1. As the night unfolded, Ethan couldn't ignore the subtle but unmistakable shift in Leah's demeanor. Around Mark, she was vibrant and engaged, laughing at his jokes and leaning in just slightly too close. With Ethan, she seemed distracted, her responses clipped and distant. "Do you want another drink?" he asked her at one point, hoping to pull her away from the growing circle of colleagues that had gathered around Mark. Leah barely glanced at him. "I'm fine, thanks." Ethan clenched his jaw, stepping back to observe the group from a distance. Leah's laugh echoed across the room, light and uninhibited. It was the kind of laugh he hadn't heard from her in months, and it wasn't meant for him. At one point, Mark excused himself to take a call, and Leah drifted toward the buffet table. Ethan seized the opportunity to approach her. "You and Mark seem close," he said, his tone casual but probing. Leah froze for a moment before shrugging. "He's my boss. We have to work closely on a lot of projects." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "That close?" She sighed, clearly exasperated. "Ethan, don't start. This is supposed to be a fun night." Her deflection stung, but Ethan bit his tongue. Confronting her here, surrounded by her colleagues, wouldn't accomplish anything. As the evening wore on, Ethan's unease deepened. He noticed the way Mark's eyes followed Leah whenever she moved through the room, and the way her body language softened when she returned to his orbit. They weren't overtly inappropriate, but there was an undeniable intimacy in their interactions, a familiarity that felt out of place. Ethan tried to distract himself by striking up conversations with a few of Leah's coworkers, but his attention kept drifting back to her. He watched as Mark whispered something in her ear, making her laugh. The sight was like a knife twisting in his chest. 8. Later, as the party began to wind down, Ethan stepped out onto the balcony for some air. The cool night breeze did little to calm his racing thoughts. He leaned against the railing, staring out at the city lights, when he heard voices nearby. Turning his head slightly, he saw Leah and Mark standing near the doorway, partially obscured by a column. They were speaking in hushed tones, their faces close. "Not here," Leah whispered, her voice urgent. "He might see." Mark's reply was too quiet to make out, but the way Leah nodded, her expression tense, made Ethan's blood run cold. He stepped back into the shadows, his heart pounding. The words echoed in his mind, their implication undeniable. He wanted to confront them right then and there, but a wave of hesitation stopped him. Instead, he returned to the party, his mind reeling. Leah was already back in the main room, chatting with another colleague as if nothing had happened. When she caught his eye, she smiled. A practiced, effortless smile that no longer felt real. The night ended with polite goodbyes and a strained silence on the drive home. Ethan didn't bring up what he had overheard, but the question burned in his chest. Who was Leah anymore? The cracks in their life, once small and manageable, were now threatening to shatter everything they had built. And for the first time, Ethan wasn't sure he could hold it all together. Would you like me to continue with the next section? The tension between them had become unbearable. Ethan couldn't shake the memory of Leah's whispered words at the holiday party, or the way her body language betrayed a closeness with Mark that went beyond professional. Nights grew colder, conversations shorter, and the weight of suspicion pressed heavier on his chest with every passing day. One evening, after Leah left for yet another late night at work, Ethan found himself pacing the apartment. Questions he had been too afraid to confront churned in his mind. He couldn't keep living like this, always doubting, always wondering. His eyes landed on Leah's laptop sitting on the desk. She had left it behind, an unusual oversight for someone who guarded her devices so closely. A rush of unease coursed through him. He hesitated, his heart pounding in his ears, before crossing the room. "This isn't right," he muttered, but his hands moved on their own, opening the laptop. It wasn't locked. The desktop was neat, almost too neat, with only a handful of files visible. Ethan opened the folder labeled Work, but it contained nothing unusual. Meeting notes, presentations, case briefs. He was about to close it when he noticed another folder at the bottom of the screen. It was titled with a single emoji, a lock. His stomach tightened. The folder required a password, and for a moment he hesitated, but the weight of everything, the distance, the whispers, the way she had changed, pushed him forward. He tried the obvious choices. Her birthday, their anniversary, the name of their first dog. None worked. Finally, he typed, Mark. The screen blinked, and the folder opened. Yeah. Ethan's hands froze as he stared at the contents. Dozens of photos and messages loaded in front of him, their thumbnails glaringly vivid against the black background. His breath hitched. He clicked on the first image. There it was, Leah and Mark, laughing, kissing, wrapped around each other like they used to be. Another click, another image. Leah sitting on Mark's lap in a hotel room, champagne glasses on the table beside them. His hands shook. He opened the messages next. The words blurred as tears welled in his eyes. Their conversations were playful, intimate, and filled with inside jokes Ethan didn't understand. One message stood out, a snapshot of betrayal, frozen in time. I can't wait until this is all behind us, just a little longer. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. His world stopped. Yeah. He sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the screen, his mind racing. The betrayal was undeniable, but what did Leah mean by all behind us? A little longer for what? As he scrolled further, he found files that had nothing to do with their affair. Documents detailing financial transactions, spreadsheets marked with client names, and cryptic notes that hinted at something far worse. Ethan didn't understand all of it, but one thing was clear. Leah and Mark weren't just having an affair. They were involved in something illegal. When Leah returned home that night, Ethan was sitting in the living room, the laptop open on the coffee table. She froze in the doorway, her face pale. "Ethan, what are you doing?" "You tell me," he said, his voice cold and unfamiliar, even to himself. He turned the screen toward her, the damning evidence displayed in stark detail. "What is this, Leah?" Her eyes widened, and for a moment she didn't answer. Then she straightened, her expression hardening. "Go." "It's not what you think," she said. "Not what I think," Ethan snapped, his voice rising. "You've been lying to me, cheating on me, and this isn't just an affair, Leah. What the hell are you involved in?" She took a step forward, her voice low and sharp. "You don't understand, Ethan. You're digging into things you shouldn't." "Don't," he said, his hands trembling. "Don't turn this on me. Tell me the truth, all of it." But Leah said nothing, her silence cutting deeper than any words could. That night, Ethan packed a bag and left. He couldn't stay in the same space as her, not after what he had seen. As he drove aimlessly through the city, the reality of her betrayal weighed down on him. The woman he had built his life with, the woman he thought he knew, was a stranger. But even as anger and heartbreak consumed him, one question loomed larger than the rest. What had Leah and Mark gotten themselves into, and how far did it go? Would you like me to continue with the next segment? The days following Ethan's discovery passed in a blur. He hadn't spoken to Leah since he left, and his emotions swung wildly between fury, despair, and disbelief. Sitting in his car outside a diner one afternoon, his phone buzzed with an unknown number. Normally, he would have ignored it, but something compelled him to answer. "Ethan Miller?" the voice on the other end asked, soft but steady. "Yes, who's this?" "This is Tessa," she said, her tone careful. "Mark's wife." Ethan's grip tightened on the phone. "What do you want?" There was a pause before she continued, her voice dropping lower. "We need to talk. It's about Leah and Mark and everything else they've been doing." Yeah. An hour later, Ethan met Tessa at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town. She was a striking woman with sharp features, her expression a mix of exhaustion and determination. "Thank you for meeting me," she said as they sat down, her hands clutching a large folder. Ethan folded his arms across his chest. "I'm not sure why I'm here." Tessa leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because I know what you found. And I know it's only the tip of the iceberg." Her words sent a chill down Ethan's spine. Go on. She opened the folder, spreading out a series of documents, photographs, and printouts of emails. Ethan's stomach churned as he scanned the materials. Bank transactions, contracts, and messages that painted a damning picture. They've been running a scheme for years, Tessa explained, her tone cold and precise. Mark and Leah target vulnerable clients, wealthy ones with secrets they don't want exposed. They blackmail them, siphon money, and cover it up through shell companies. Ethan stared at the evidence, his chest tightening. Why Leah? Why would she get involved in something like this? Tessa's eyes narrowed. Mark has a way of pulling people in. He's manipulative, persuasive, and ruthless. Leah probably thought she was in control, but no one is with Mark. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his mind reeling. Why are you telling me this? Why not go to the police? Tessa's expression darkened. Because they have leverage on me, too. I've known about this for months, but Mark made it clear. If I talk, he'll destroy me. My career, my family, everything. And if you're not careful, Ethan, they'll do the same to you. Her words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. They've ruined lives, Ethan, she continued. People who trusted them, who thought they were safe. And they'll ruin yours if you let them. Yeah. Ethan shook his head, his voice rising with frustration. I can't just sit back and do nothing. They need to be stopped. Tessa reached across the table, her eyes fierce. I'm not saying you should do nothing, but you need to be smart. Mark and Leah don't play fair. They'll come after you the second they think you're a threat. Her warning struck a nerve. Ethan thought of the messages he'd seen on Leah's laptop, the secrecy, the lies. He thought of the man he used to be, the one who believed in loyalty, trust, and love. I won't let them get away with this, he said finally, his voice firm. Tessa nodded, sliding the folder toward him. Then take this. It's everything I've been able to gather. If you're serious about taking them down, you'll need it. Ethan hesitated before accepting the folder, his hands trembling slightly. Why are you helping me? Tessa gave a bitter smile. Because I've been too afraid to act on my own. But if we work together, maybe we can finally put an end to this. They spent the next hour combing through the evidence, piecing together the extent of the scheme. Ethan's anger grew with every revelation, but so did his resolve. As they prepared to leave, Tessa placed a hand on his arm. Be careful, Ethan. They won't go down without a fight. He nodded, his jaw set. Neither will I. The drive home was long and silent, the folder of evidence sitting on the passenger seat like a ticking time bomb. Ethan's mind raced with plans, questions, and doubts. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just about Leah's betrayal anymore. It was about justice, and he wasn't going to stop until the truth came to light. Would you like me to continue with the next section? The next morning, Ethan sat at his dining table, the folder from Tessa spread out in front of him. He was running on fumes, having spent most of the night poring over every piece of evidence. His mind was a whirlwind of anger and determination. The thought of Leah and Mark profiting from the destruction of others left a bitter taste in his mouth. He was scrolling through his email, looking for any leads on legal representation, when a notification popped up. It was a new message sent from an anonymous address. The subject line read simply, "Stop." Ethan hesitated before clicking it, dread pooling in his stomach. The email was short, but its meaning was unmistakable. You're playing a dangerous game, Ethan. Drop it now or you'll regret it. He leaned back in his chair, the words blurring as anger coursed through him. They knew. Somehow they knew he had the evidence. His initial instinct was to call Tessa, but he paused, realizing it was likely too dangerous to involve her further. Moments later, his phone buzzed. The caller ID read, unknown. Ethan's hand hovered over the device before answering. Hello? A cold male voice came through. You've had your fun, Mr. Miller. Now it's time to step away. Who is this? Ethan demanded, though he already had a sinking feeling about the answer. You've seen enough to know what we're capable of, the voice continued, ignoring his question. Walk away, and we'll pretend this never happened. Stay involved, and you'll regret it." There was a click as the line disconnected. Ethan slammed the phone down, his frustration boiling over. The warning had the opposite effect of what was intended. Instead of scaring him off, it solidified his resolve. If they were threatening him, it meant they were afraid of what he might do. Ethan paced the room, trying to think of his next move. The folder Tessa gave him was damning, but it wasn't enough to bring the operation down. He needed more. Then, an idea struck him. Leia's laptop. That evening, he returned to the apartment under the guise of picking up a few personal items. Leah was there, seated on the couch, her expression unreadable as he walked in. "You've been avoiding me," she said, breaking the silence. Ethan kept his tone neutral. "Just needed some time to think." She studied him for a moment before nodding. "Take whatever you need." He moved through the apartment quickly, grabbing clothes and toiletries, but his real goal was the laptop still sitting on the desk. As he picked it up, Leah's voice stopped him. "What are you doing with that?" Ethan turned, his heart pounding. "It's mine, remember? You gave it to me last Christmas." Her eyes narrowed, suspicion flickering across her face, but she didn't argue. "Fine, take it." Once he was back in his car, he powered it on. He knew Leah would have likely wiped anything incriminating by now, but he hoped to find traces of deleted files or remnants in her email history. As he worked, a new message appeared on the screen. It was another email, this time with an attachment. The subject line read, "Last warning." Ethan hesitated before opening it. The attachment was a photograph of him at the cafe with Tessa, taken from across the street. His blood ran cold. Beneath the image was a single line, "We're watching." Ethan's hands shook as he stared at the screen. The threat was crystal clear, but it only fueled his determination. He refused to be bullied into silence, no matter how high the stakes. He closed the laptop, his mind racing. If they were this desperate to stop him, it meant he was onto something big. He needed to act quickly, but he also needed to be smart. As he drove away, his grip on the steering wheel tightened. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for every person Leia and Mark had hurt, and for the life they had stolen from him. The game was on, and Ethan wasn't backing down. Would you like to continue with the next part? Ethan couldn't wait any longer. He had spent days gathering every piece of evidence he could find, meticulously piecing together the tangled web of deceit Leah and Mark had spun. The weight of the truth was suffocating, and he needed answers, no matter how painful. That evening, he returned to the apartment. Leah was in the kitchen, her back to him as she rinsed a glass in the sink. For a moment, he stood silently in the doorway, watching her, his mind torn between the woman he had loved and the stranger she had become. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but firm. "How long?" Leah turned, startled. "What?" Ethan stepped into the room, his expression hard. "How long, Leah? How long have you been lying to me?" Her face paled, but she quickly recovered, setting the glass down with forced composure. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't," Ethan snapped, his voice cracking with anger. He pulled out the folder Tessa had given him and dropped it onto the counter between them. "This, all of this. How long?" Leah's eyes flickered to the folder, her mask of calm slipping for a brief moment. "You've been snooping through my life now?" "Snooping?" Ethan's voice rose. "You've been cheating on me? Lying to me? Stealing from people? And you're going to stand there and act like I'm the problem?" Leah crossed her arms, her jaw tightening. "You wouldn't understand, Ethan. You never did." Ugh. Ethan took a step closer, his fists clenched. "Then help me understand. Tell me why the woman I married is involved in blackmail, fraud, and God knows what else." Leah's eyes filled with a mix of defiance and something that looked like regret. "You think I wanted this?" she shot back, her voice trembling. "Do you have any idea what it's like to feel stuck? To feel like you're suffocating every single day? Mark offered me a way out, a way to be more than just this." Ethan stared at her, his chest tight. "So this is my fault? That's what you're saying?" "I'm saying," Leah said, her voice softening, that I did what I had to do. For me. For us. For us? Ethan laughed bitterly. Don't you dare. Don't you dare pretend this was for us. You destroyed everything we built, everything I thought we had. Ed? Leah turned away, gripping the edge of the counter. You think it's that simple? That I could just walk away? Mark isn't someone you say no to, Ethan. Once you're in, you're in. Ethan's voice softened, but the pain in his tone was unmistakable. You had a choice, Leah. You could have come to me. You could have trusted me. Leah shook her head. And what? Watch you try to fix something you couldn't even begin to understand? You don't know what it's like to be desperate. The words stung more than Ethan wanted to admit. He looked at her, searching for any trace of the woman he had fallen in love with, but all he saw was someone he didn't recognize. Yeah. The confrontation ended with Leah retreating to the bedroom, slamming the door behind her. Ethan stayed in the kitchen, staring at the folder. The fight had left him drained, but it had also cemented his resolve. Leah might have chosen her path, but he wasn't going to let her drag him down with her. The next morning, Ethan contacted Olivia Hayes, a sharp and experienced attorney recommended by a friend. He laid everything out for her. The affair, the fraud, the threats. Olivia listened intently, her expression unreadable. This isn't just about a messy divorce, she said finally. If what you're saying is true, we're dealing with criminal activity. This could get very dangerous. I don't care, Ethan said, his voice steady. I just want justice. Over the next few weeks, Ethan worked closely with Olivia, gathering more evidence and building a case. But it wasn't long before Leah's firm began fighting back. Anonymous threats escalated. Texts, emails, even a cryptic note left on his windshield. They tried to smear his reputation, spreading rumors that he was unstable, even accusing him of fabricating the evidence. It was a relentless campaign of intimidation, but Ethan refused to back down. One evening, as he sat in Olivia's office reviewing documents, her phone buzzed with an urgent notification. She glanced at the screen, her expression darkening. What is it? Ethan asked. There's been an incident at Leah's firm, Olivia said, setting the phone down. A disgruntled ex-employee walked into their offices and opened fire. Ethan's breath caught. Is Leah? She's alive, Olivia said, but several others didn't make it. It's all over the news. The weight of the moment settled over him. The tragedy was horrifying, but it also meant something else. Scrutiny. The firm's secrets, long buried, were about to come to light. In the days that followed, investigators uncovered a trove of evidence linking Leah, Mark, and other senior members of the firm to a wide array of crimes. The shooting had cracked the facade of their operation, and now the entire structure was collapsing. Ethan watched the coverage on the news, a mix of emotions swirling inside him. Relief that justice was finally being served, sadness for the lives lost, and an aching sense of finality as the life he had known crumbled around him. Leah's betrayal had been devastating, but now it was clear this was bigger than either of them, and Ethan wasn't done fighting yet. Would you like me to proceed with the next section? The retaliation began almost immediately after Ethan took legal action. At first, it was subtle. Missed calls from potential new clients he hadn't expected. Emails that mysteriously failed to send. But the attacks quickly escalated, becoming bolder and more threatening. One morning, as Ethan walked to his car, he found a note tucked under the windshield wiper. The handwriting was jagged, hurried. Drop it, or you'll lose everything. He scanned the empty street, but no one was in sight. He crumpled the note and shoved it into his pocket, his pulse racing. The threats were unnerving, but they only solidified his resolve. Leah's firm was panicking, and he wasn't about to let them intimidate him into silence. Yep. That afternoon, Ethan sat in Olivia Hayes' office, the note resting on the desk between them. Olivia picked it up, her expression unreadable as she examined it. They're desperate, she said, setting the note down. That's a good sign. Ethan frowned. It doesn't feel like a good sign. It means they know we have something on them, Olivia explained. But it also means they're willing to fight dirty. You need to be prepared for more of this. Yeah. Olivia wasn't wrong. Over the next week, Ethan's life became a whirlwind of sabotage and psychological warfare. His credit card was inexplicably frozen, leaving him stranded at a grocery store until he could resolve the issue. His boss at work received an anonymous tip accusing Ethan of embezzling funds, forcing him to defend his reputation. Even his car wasn't spared. A slashed tire greeted him one evening as he left the office. "Whoever's behind this is relentless," Ethan told Olivia during another late-night meeting. His exhaustion was evident, but so was his determination. "How do we fight back?" "We stay the course," Olivia said firmly. "This is a scare tactic. They're hoping you'll back down. If we press forward, they'll slip up, and when they do, we'll be ready." Yeah. Despite the chaos, Ethan refused to let the firm's intimidation derail his fight for justice. With Olivia's guidance, he worked tirelessly to gather additional evidence and strengthen their case. Late nights became the norm. His apartment transformed into a makeshift war room filled with binders, charts, and timelines. But the pressure was unrelenting. One evening, as he sifted through a stack of documents, his phone buzzed. It was another anonymous text. "Last warning. Walk away or you'll regret it." He stared at the message for a long moment before typing a response. "I'm not afraid of you." Hitting send felt like reclaiming a piece of his life. Yeah. As the threats continued, Olivia took measures to protect him. She contacted a private investigator to trace the origins of the emails and texts, while advising Ethan to limit his movements and avoid discussing the case in public. One evening, Olivia called with an update. "We traced the emails to a server linked to one of the firm's senior partners," she said. "They're not even trying to hide their involvement anymore." Ethan let out a bitter laugh. "That's because they think they're untouchable." "They won't be for long," Olivia said. "We're closing in, Ethan. They're making mistakes, and it's only a matter of time before we have enough to bring them down." The turning point came unexpectedly. Ethan was reviewing a financial ledger tied to one of the firm's shell companies when he noticed an inconsistency, an overlooked transaction that linked Mark directly to a fraudulent account. It was the smoking gun they needed. He called Olivia immediately, his voice trembling with a mix of excitement and exhaustion. "I think I found it, the proof we've been looking for." "Send it to me," Olivia said, her tone sharp and focused. "This could be the breakthrough we need." Yeah. With the new evidence in hand, Olivia moved swiftly, filing additional charges and pushing for an expedited hearing. The firm's retaliation attempts grew increasingly desperate, but Ethan no longer felt afraid. The tide was turning, and he could sense their grip weakening. For the first time in months, he felt something he hadn't thought possible: hope. The battle wasn't over, but Ethan knew he was no longer fighting alone. With Olivia's expertise and his own unwavering determination, he was ready for whatever came next. The firm's annual networking gala was in full swing, a grand affair held at a luxury hotel downtown. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers, and the air buzzed with the low hum of conversation. Senior partners mingled with high-profile clients, toasting deals and projecting an image of power and success. Leah and Mark were at the center of it all, their polished smiles masking the cracks beneath the surface. Ethan wasn't there, but he'd been keeping tabs. Olivia had advised him to stay away from any direct confrontation while the investigation was ongoing. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to give. Just as the evening hit its peak, a commotion erupted near the entrance. Heads turned as a man burst into the room, his face red with fury and his voice echoing over the murmurs of the crowd. "You ruined me," he shouted, pointing an accusatory finger toward Mark and Leah. His disheveled appearance and trembling hands contrasted sharply with the polished atmosphere. Security rushed to intervene, but he held his ground, clutching a thick envelope in his hands. "You think you can get away with it, with stealing from people, destroying their lives?" Mark stepped forward, his calm demeanor wavering. "You need to leave," he said, his voice low and firm. The man laughed bitterly, tossing the envelope onto the floor. Papers spilled out. Emails, bank statements, and contracts. "No," he said, his voice shaking with anger. Everyone here deserves to know the truth." The room fell silent, as curious onlookers leaned in to examine the scattered documents. Whispers rippled through the crowd, growing louder as the damning evidence came into focus. Leah's face went pale, her usually composed mask cracking under the weight of the unfolding chaos. One of the clients picked up a document, their expression shifting from confusion to outrage. "What is this?" they demanded, holding up a sheet of paper. Mark tried to regain control, but it was too late. Phones were already out, capturing the scene, and the whispers turned to accusations. And within minutes, the event descended into pandemonium. The disgruntled man was escorted out, but the damage had been done. The carefully curated image of the firm was shattered, and the crimes Leah and Mark had tried so hard to conceal were now on full display. For Ethan, who heard the news later that night, it was a bittersweet moment. Justice was finally within reach, but the cost of truth was heavy. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Ethan sat quietly in the gallery, his hands folded tightly in his lap. He had been here countless times over the past few months, watching the trial unfold. Today, however, was different. Today would bring closure. Leah sat at the defense table, her once confident posture now weighed down by the gravity of the situation. She looked tired, her face drawn, her hair pulled back in a tight bun. Mark sat beside her, his expression cold and impassive, as though he still believed he could manipulate his way out of this. The judge's voice cut through the tension. "Leah Morgan and Mark Rivers, you have been found guilty of conspiracy, fraud, and embezzlement. This court sentences you to 10 years in federal prison." Gasps rippled through the room, followed by murmurs of approval. Ethan exhaled slowly, a bittersweet relief washing over him. The woman he had once loved, the woman he had planned a life with, was now a convicted criminal. Justice had been served, but the cost felt immeasurable. As the courtroom cleared, Ethan stayed in his seat, staring at the empty bench where Leah had been. Olivia Hayes, his attorney, approached him, her expression a mix of satisfaction and concern. "You did it," she said, sitting down beside him. "Their operation is dismantled, and their victims are getting restitution. It's a win." Ethan nodded, though his heart still felt heavy. "It doesn't feel like a win," he admitted. "Not really." Olivia placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "That's because you're a good man, Ethan. But this isn't just about Leah or Mark. It's about holding people accountable and making things right." He offered her a small, grateful smile. "Thanks, Olivia, for everything." Yeah. The following weeks brought a mix of emotions. Headlines about the trial and sentencing filled the news, detailing the extent of the firm's corruption and the lives it had ruined. Ethan couldn't escape the public interest, but he found solace in knowing he had done the right thing. Still, there were quiet moments when the weight of it all pressed down on him. Sitting in his apartment one evening, he pulled out the adventure fund jar. It was nearly empty now, save for a few coins and a crumpled dollar bill. He turned it over in his hands, remembering the dreams he and Leah had once shared. Those dreams were gone, but Ethan realized so too was the man who had been willing to ignore the cracks in his life for the sake of false perfection. He was stronger now, more self-aware, and for the first time in a long time, he felt free. In the months that followed, Ethan began to rebuild. He sold the apartment, packed up his belongings, and moved to a quieter part of town. He took up running, something he hadn't done in years, and started volunteering at a local community center. Helping others gave him purpose and reminded him that there was still good in the world. One evening, after a volunteer event, he met Sarah. She was warm and kind, with a genuine smile that lit up the room. Their conversations were easy, and she had a way of making Ethan laugh, a sound he hadn't heard from himself in far too long. They began spending time together, slowly and without pressure. Sarah wasn't just a distraction. She was a reminder that life could still hold joy and connection. With her, Ethan felt no need to pretend or hide his past. She accepted him for who he was, scars and all. On a crisp autumn night, Ethan and Sarah sat around a fire pit in her backyard. sipping cider and watching the flames dance. Ethan glanced at her, a sense of peace settling over him. "Do you ever think about starting over completely?" he asked. Sarah tilted her head, considering his question. "Starting over doesn't mean forgetting the past. It just means using it to build something better." Ethan nodded, her words resonating deeply. He reached into his bag and pulled out the Adventure Fund jar, setting it on the table between them. "I used to think this was the future," he said. "Now, I think it's just a reminder to keep dreaming." Sarah smiled, her eyes warm. "Then let's fill it again, together." As the flames crackled and the night stretched on, Ethan felt a renewed sense of hope. He had faced betrayal, heartbreak, and danger, but he had come out on the other side stronger, wiser, and ready to embrace whatever came next. But even as he moved forward, there was a quiet unease lingering in the background. A few days earlier, he had received an anonymous letter in the mail. It was simple, unassuming, but the message was chilling. "You may think it's over, but it's not." Ethan folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer, unwilling to let it dictate his life. For now, he chose to focus on the present, the warmth of Sarah's laughter, the crackle of the fire, and the knowledge that, no matter what came next, he had the strength to face it. Would you like me to continue with Sarah's story or provide additional details on Ethan's rebuilding process? Ethan wasn't looking for love. After everything he had been through, the idea of opening himself up to someone else felt impossible. Yet, life had a way of surprising him. It was a warm spring evening when he first met Sarah. He had volunteered to help set up a fundraiser at the local community center, an event to support underprivileged youth. She was directing a group of volunteers, clipboard in hand, her voice clear and confident as she organized tables and decorations. Ethan watched her from a distance, struck by her natural ease and the way she moved through the crowd with purpose. It wasn't until she caught him struggling to tie a stubborn banner to a pole that their paths truly crossed. "Need a hand?" she asked, her smile warm and disarming. Ethan chuckled, stepping aside. "Apparently, banners are my weakness." She laughed, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Don't worry, we all have our thing." "Mine's remembering names. I've probably introduced myself to the same person 3 times tonight." Ethan grinned, the tension in his chest easing for the first time in weeks. "I'm Ethan, by the way. Just once, so you don't have to worry about forgetting." "Sarah," she replied, shaking his hand, "and I'll do my best." The evening passed quickly, with Ethan and Sarah working side by side to ensure the event's success. Her energy was infectious, and Ethan found himself smiling more than he had in months. By the end of the night, as they packed up chairs and tables, she turned to him with a curious look. "You're new to the center, aren't you?" she asked. "I think I'd remember you if you weren't." "Yeah," Ethan admitted. "I started volunteering a few weeks ago. Just needed a change." Sarah nodded, her expression softening. "Sometimes, a fresh start is the best thing we can give ourselves." Ethan felt a flicker of something, hope, maybe, as her words sank in. He didn't know much about her, but there was an openness to Sarah that drew him in, a stark contrast to the guarded walls he had grown so used to. Over the next few weeks, their paths crossed more often. Whether it was at the community center or casual coffee meetups after events, Ethan and Sarah's conversations grew deeper. She was honest and direct, unafraid to share her own struggles and triumphs. Her candor was refreshing, a reminder that vulnerability didn't always have to be met with betrayal. One evening, after a long day of volunteering, they sat on a park bench overlooking a quiet pond. The air was filled with the scent of fresh blooms, and the setting sun painted the water in shades of orange and gold. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah said, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "Of course," Ethan replied. "What brought you here, to the center, I mean?" Ethan hesitated, the weight of his past threatening to pull him under. But there was something about Sarah, her sincerity, her patience, that made him feel safe. "I went through something," he began slowly. "Something that shook up my entire life. I needed to get out of my own head, to feel like I was doing something good, even if it was small." Sarah nodded, her gaze steady. That takes a lot of courage, turning pain into something meaningful. Ethan met her eyes, and for the first time, he felt like someone truly saw him, not as a victim or a man defined by his scars, but as someone capable of rebuilding. As their friendship deepened, so did their connection. Sarah had a way of grounding Ethan, of reminding him that life was more than the sum of its worst moments. She encouraged him to dream again, to laugh without hesitation, and to embrace the idea that love could still be real, even after heartbreak. One evening, as they walked along a tree-lined path near the community center, Ethan found himself speaking without thinking. "I don't know how you do it." Sarah glanced at him, her brow furrowing slightly. "Do what?" "Make everything feel lighter," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "You remind me that it's okay to move forward, even when it feels impossible." She smiled, her hand brushing his briefly as they walked. "That's the thing about moving forward. It's not about forgetting what's behind you. It's about deciding it doesn't get to hold you back." It wasn't a sudden realization, but rather a slow, steady unfolding. Ethan was falling for Sarah. It scared him, but it also felt different, safe, grounded, and real. With her, there was no facade, no pretending. She saw his wounds and didn't try to fix them. She simply walked beside him as he healed. When Ethan finally told her about Leah, about everything he had endured, Sarah listened without judgment. She reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "You've been through hell," she said softly, "but you're still here, and that's not nothing." Ethan smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile. "You make it easier to keep going." Sarah grinned. "Good, because I'm not going anywhere." As the weeks turned to months, Ethan realized that Sarah wasn't just helping him heal. She was showing him what it meant to truly live. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe in the possibility of happiness. Would you like me to continue with the final section or refine this part further? The morning sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting soft patterns on the wooden floor of Ethan's new apartment. Life had begun to feel normal again, or at least something close to it. The chaos of the trial, the betrayal, and the heartbreak had faded into the background, replaced by quiet moments of peace and hope. Ethan had just finished his morning coffee when the faint rustle of mail being delivered caught his attention. He opened the door to find a small stack of envelopes on the doormat, a few bills, a community flyer, and a plain white envelope with no return address. Something about it made him pause. The envelope was slightly heavier than usual, its edges crisp and unmarked. He hesitated for a moment, then tore it open carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed in bold, black letters. "You may have won, but it's not over." Yep. Ethan stared at the words, his breath catching in his throat. The simplicity of the message made it all the more chilling. He turned the envelope over, searching for clues, but there was nothing. No handwriting, no postmark, no indication of who had sent it. A cold sense of unease settled over him. He thought of Leah, sitting behind bars, and Mark, whose presence loomed large even in his absence. Could one of them have orchestrated this? Or was there someone else connected to their operation who hadn't been uncovered? His mind raced with possibilities, each one more troubling than the last. Later that day, he met Sarah at their favorite cafe. She noticed the tension in his face immediately. "What's wrong?" Ethan hesitated, then slid the letter across the table. She read it, her brow furrowing. "Do you think it's serious?" she asked, her voice steady but concerned. "I don't know," Ethan admitted, "but whoever sent this wanted to remind me that they're still out there." Sarah reached for his hand, her grip firm and reassuring. "You've faced worse than this, Ethan. Whatever it is, we'll deal with it together." As they left the cafe, Ethan folded the letter and slipped it into his jacket pocket. He couldn't shake the feeling that his past wasn't entirely behind him, but as he walked beside Sarah, her hand in his, he reminded himself that he wasn't facing it alone anymore. Whatever lay ahead, he was ready.